There is a number your mortgage broker never showed you, your realtor never mentioned, and your bank is legally not required to put in writing. It is the number that describes how much of your net worth disappears if American housing corrects by half. And in 9 specific US cities right now, that correction is not a forecast. It is not a worst-case scenario. It is a process that has already started, and the only people who do not know it are the people who still own the homes. The data is public. The mechanisms are visible. The window to act is closing faster than anyone selling you a mortgage, a listing, or a refinance has any incentive to admit. Hi, I'm going to walk you through 9 American cities where the math has already broken, what specifically is breaking it, and what financially literate homeowners in those markets are quietly doing right now while their neighbors are still arguing in the Zillow comments. Let's start with how we got here, because you cannot understand the correction without understanding the bubble. Go back to 2010. America had just spent 3 years cleaning up the wreckage of the 2008 housing collapse. Trillions in lost home equity, 10 million foreclosures, an entire generation of first-time buyers who watched their parents lose everything and decided renting was not the worst thing in the world. The lesson, the story went, had been learned. The regulations were tightened. Dodd-Frank was passed. The subprime lenders were dead. American housing, the consensus said, would never make that mistake again. What that consensus did not say was that the Federal Reserve had dropped the federal funds rate to effectively zero and was going to keep it there for almost a decade. What it did not say was that quantitative easing was pumping trillions of dollars into mortgage-backed securities, suppressing rates so far below their natural level that the price of money itself stopped functioning as a signal. What it did not say was that institutional investors, hedge funds, private equity firms, the kind of money that had never bought single-family homes before, were buying them now by the tens of thousands. Blackstone alone bought more than 50,000 homes through Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, Tricon, Progress Residential. Names that meant nothing to a buyer at an open house. Names that were sitting on the other side of every bidding war that buyer lost. What that capital created, whether intentionally or through a sequence of individually defensible decisions, was the second housing bubble in a generation. Different mechanism, same result. By the middle of 2022, the median American home price had climbed past $410,000. The median American household income was sitting around $75,000. That is a price-to-income ratio above 5-to-1 nationally. In the markets we are about to cover, the ratio is closer to 8 or 9-to-1. In healthy markets, economists start raising flags at 3-to-1. At 8-to-1, you are not in a housing market. You are in a balloon, and somebody is still pumping. Here is the thing about balloons that everyone forgets. They do not deflate, they pop, and they pop from the weakest seam. The weakest seam in the American housing market is the buyer who stretched the furthest to get in. The young family that put 3% down on an FHA loan in 2021. The investor who bought 4 single-family rentals in Phoenix on a DSCR loan with the cash flow projection penciled at 3% rates. The remote worker who bought a house in Boise, sight unseen because their company said the office was closed forever. When that seam goes, every other seam in the structure feels it. Here is what makes the next 3 years different from every American housing dip in the last 30 years. It is not one problem, it is 5 problems, and they are all arriving at the same time from 5 different directions, and each one is making the other 4 worse. Problem 1 is the rate lock paradox. Roughly 60% of American mortgage holders are sitting on a rate below 4%. A meaningful chunk are below 3%. They cannot move. Selling means giving up a sub-4 mortgage and buying back into a 7% market, which on the same house means a payment 50 to 70% higher, so they don't sell. Inventory stays artificially low, the headline price holds, and everyone tells themselves the market is fine. But underneath that frozen surface, life keeps happening, divorces happen, job transfers happen, deaths happen, medical events happen. The forced sellers, the ones who do not get to choose their timing, are the only sellers transacting in a lot of these markets right now. And forced sellers do not negotiate. They take the offer that closes. Problem 2 is the insurance crisis. And this one is going to redraw the map. Insurance carriers are pulling out of entire states: Florida, Louisiana, California. Premiums in coastal counties have doubled, tripled, in some cases quadrupled in 3 years. In some zip codes in Florida, you literally cannot get a private policy at any price. Citizens Property Insurance, the state-backed insurer of last resort, is now the largest carrier in Florida by a margin that should terrify anyone paying attention. A property you cannot insure is a property you cannot mortgage. A property you cannot mortgage is a property only a cash buyer will touch. And cash buyers demand a discount. That discount is the floor of your home's value. Problem 3 is the institutional retreat. The same private equity firms that bought hundreds of thousands of single-family homes between 2012 and 2022 are now net sellers in several Sunbelt markets. They built their thesis on a specific math: low rates, rising rents, infinite appreciation. 2 of those 3 variables have flipped. They are not selling because they want to. They are selling because their internal rate of return models stopped working. And when the institutional buyer that was the marginal bid in your neighborhood becomes the marginal seller, the price you thought was the price was never the price. Problem 4 is the property tax reassessment wave. Most American counties reassess on a lag. Homes that were bought at 2021 peak prices are now being reassessed at 2023 and 2024 valuations. In states without strong assessment caps, the property tax bill on the same house is jumping 20, 30, sometimes 50%. That increase lands on top of an insurance bill that already doubled, on top of an HOA assessment that is rising because the HOA's reserves are short, on top of a mortgage payment that, for variable rate or recent adjustable rate mortgage borrowers, is also moving the wrong direction. Problem 5 is the one nobody in real estate wants to discuss in public: climate-driven population reversal. The Sunbelt migration story that drove a decade of appreciation in Phoenix, Austin, Tampa, and a dozen Florida counties was built on a quiet assumption that the weather would stay manageable, the water would stay available, and the insurance would stay affordable. All 3 are now in question simultaneously. People are still moving to these places, but the net flow is slowing, and in some specific markets, it has already reversed. 5 forces, not sequential, simultaneous. They are already active, and they are concentrated most severely in 9 specific American cities. Let me be clear about how I ranked these. I looked at price-to-income ratios, investor ownership concentration, insurance market exposure, climate risk pricing, employment-based diversity, and inventory absorption rates. This is not a vibe. This is arithmetic. Number 9, Boise, Idaho. Boise was the poster child for the pandemic migration trade. Remote workers from California, from Seattle, from Portland landed in a small Mountain West city with a low cost of living, light traffic, and a lifestyle pitch that wrote itself. Between 2020 and 2022, the median Boise home price nearly doubled. In 24 months, a city where the median household income sat around $75,000 saw its median home price cross $550,000. That is a ratio that has no historical precedent in that market. The reversal started in late 2022, and it has not stopped. Boise prices have already corrected somewhere between 15 and 20% from the peak, depending on which neighborhood you are looking at. And the people in the comments who say the bottom is in are making the same mistake people made in Phoenix in 2007. Here is what is still ahead of Boise. The remote workers who drove the appreciation are being called back to offices in California and Washington. The institutional buyers that scooped up entry-level inventory in 2021 are quietly listing. The local employment base outside of healthcare, government, and Micron is thin. And Idaho's wildfire insurance market is following the California pattern. About 3 years on a delay, Boise is not finished correcting. It paused. There is a difference. Number 8, Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas has done this before. Anyone who lived through the 2008 cycle remembers what happened to that market. Median home prices in Las Vegas fell more than 60% from peak to trough between 2006 and 2011. That history did not stop the same patterns from rebuilding. It just made the people who lived through it watch the rebuild with a sick feeling in their stomach. Las Vegas housing demand is concentrated in two industries that are not as stable as the tourist brochures suggest: hospitality and construction. Both are exposed to recession in ways the local economy has not had to absorb in 15 years. Layer on top of that one of the highest investor ownership concentrations in the country in certain zip codes, water rights pressure on the Colorado River that is not getting better, and an insurance market that is starting to flag wildfire and wind exposure for the first time in the valley's history. Vegas is also carrying a backlog of new construction in master planned communities that were approved when rates were 3% and absorption was infinite. Those homes are still being built, they are still hitting the market, and they are competing with resale inventory at price points the resale market cannot match. Number 7, Tampa, Florida. I want to be careful here because I know Floridians are tired of being lectured by people who do not live there. But the insurance math is the insurance math, and Tampa is sitting in the middle of it. Florida's homeowners insurance market is in a state of structural collapse. The average annual premium in Florida has crossed $6,000, and in some coastal counties is multiples of that amount. Carriers have left the state entirely. Citizens Property Insurance is now writing policies it was never designed to write at scale. Reinsurance costs are at all-time highs and rising. Tampa is particularly exposed because much of its housing stock is older and located in flood zones. A meaningful share of the condo inventory is in older mid-rise buildings, now facing structural reserve assessments after the Surfside collapse changed Florida law, and the buyer base ran on the same pandemic migration thesis as Boise and Phoenix. Tampa's median home price doubled in 5 years. Its median household income did not. The gap that opened between price and underlying fundamentals is the gap that has to close. It can close if wage growth catches up over a decade or if prices come down in 3 years. The math, given current insurance and property tax trajectories, points to the second path. Number 6, Cape Coral and Fort Myers, Florida. I am grouping them because they function as a single market, and they are sitting on what I genuinely believe is the most exposed housing situation in the continental United States. Cape Coral and Fort Myers were directly in the path of Hurricane Ian in 2022. The damage was catastrophic. The rebuild has been incomplete and expensive, and the insurance market that was supposed to fund it is the same market that is now refusing to write new policies in those zip codes at any price the average buyer can afford. A home you cannot insure is a home you cannot mortgage. The pool of buyers in Cape Coral has narrowed to cash buyers, second home buyers willing to self-insure, and investors making a bet that prices have already absorbed the worst news. The first two groups are price sensitive. The third group is leveraged. The price-to-income ratio in Lee County is in the range of 7 to 8 to 1. The owner occupancy rate in certain canal front neighborhoods has dropped as second home and investor buyers became the marginal demand. The next named storm season is going to test whether anyone is still standing to bid. Number 5, Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix is the market that taught a generation of investors that single-family rentals could be a real asset class. From 2012 to 2022, Phoenix home prices roughly tripled. Institutional buyers concentrated in this metro at levels that have no precedent. In some zip codes in the Phoenix metro, more than 30% of single-family homes are owned by non-occupant investors. That concentration was the engine on the way up. It is the accelerant on the way down. Institutional rental owners run on spreadsheets. When the spreadsheets stop working, the disposition decisions get made in a conference room in New York or Dallas, not at a kitchen table in Maricopa County. They do not have an emotional attachment to any specific home. They have a portfolio mandate. Phoenix is also carrying a water question that nobody wants to put on a listing. The state of Arizona has already paused new groundwater-dependent development in parts of the Phoenix metro. That is not a future problem. It is a current restriction on future supply, which sounds bullish until you realize what it actually signals: about the carrying capacity of the existing housing stock. Add in a property tax reassessment wave that is still working through the system, an insurance market that is starting to flag wildfire interface zones, and the same return to office pressure pulling remote workers back to coastal cities. Phoenix is running into a perfect storm, with air conditioning bills already at record levels. Number 4. Denver, Colorado. Denver was supposed to be different. A diversified economy, a strong job market, a lifestyle anchor that did not depend on remote work. And to be fair, Denver's economy is genuinely better than most of the markets on this list. That is not the issue. The issue is what got priced in. Denver's median home price climbed past $600,000 at peak. The metro saw the same pandemic migration tailwind every Mountain West city saw, layered on top of an already expensive baseline. By 2022, Denver was running price-to-income ratios that put it in the same conversation as parts of California. The problem is, Denver does not have California's underlying wage base in tech and finance to support those ratios. The Denver suburbs are where the real exposure sits. Buyers who could not afford Denver proper bought in Aurora, in Thornton, in towns 30 and 40 miles out, on the assumption that appreciation would catch them up to Denver pricing. Those commuter calculations were built on remote work. But remote work is being clawed back. The drive that was acceptable 2 days a week is unacceptable 4 days a week. Denver also has wildfire exposure on its western edge, and it is being repriced by the insurance market in real time. The Marshall Fire of late 2021 burned more than 1,000 homes in a Denver suburb that was not previously considered a wildfire zone. That event reset the insurance industry's understanding of where the urban wildland interface actually is. Premiums are reflecting it, but home prices have not caught up yet. Number 3. Salt Lake City, Utah. Salt Lake is a market most people do not put on a danger list, and that is exactly why I have it at number 3. Salt Lake's housing market quietly went vertical between 2019 and 2022. The city absorbed a wave of California migration, a tech sector build-out in what locals call Silicon Slopes, and a wave of investor capital that found Utah on a delay after Phoenix and Boise got too crowded. The median home price in Salt Lake County crossed $600,000. The median household income did not catch up. The specific vulnerability in Salt Lake is the concentration of recent construction in suburbs like Saratoga Springs, Eagle Mountain, and the entire Utah County build-out south of the lake. These are master-planned communities full of homes built between 2019 and 2023, sold to first-time buyers and remote workers at peak prices on near-peak rates. The buyer cohort is uniform. The mortgage exposure is uniform. The employment base is more concentrated in tech than locals like to admit, and tech sector layoffs have been rolling through 2024 and 2025 at a rate that has not yet shown up in home prices, but absolutely will. Salt Lake also has a water problem nobody wants to discuss. The Great Salt Lake itself has been losing volume at a rate that is starting to affect air quality across the entire metro. That is not a real estate factor today. It is a real estate factor by 2030. Markets that price for perfection do not get to absorb additional uncertainty without repricing. Number 2. Austin, Texas. I know. Texas is supposed to be the answer, not the problem. No state income tax, strong job growth, pro-business climate. Everything Californians wanted when they fled to Austin in 2020 and 2021. The Austin housing market is the cleanest example in America of a city that was priced perfectly for one specific future and is now living in a different one. Austin home prices roughly doubled between 2019 and 2022. The median crossed $500,000 in a metro, where the median household income was significantly lower than the coastal markets the buyers were coming from. The thesis was that Tesla, Oracle, and a wave of tech relocations would bring permanent high-income demand. That demand showed up. It also slowed. Tesla has had layoffs. Oracle has restructured. The broader tech labor market that was funding Austin's appreciation has been in a consolidation cycle since late 2022. And critically, Austin built. Austin permitted aggressively. Austin added supply at a rate most American cities cannot match. That supply is now hitting the market into a softer demand environment. Austin home prices have already corrected somewhere between 15 and 20% from the peak. That is not the bottom. Texas property taxes, which can run above 2% of assessed value annually, are now landing on those peak assessments, while income growth is slowing. The carrying cost on an Austin home bought in 2022 is materially higher today than the buyer underwrote, with no offsetting appreciation to soften the math. Austin also sits in a state where homeowners insurance is becoming a genuine problem. Texas has its own insurance market issues, with hail exposure across the central part of the state, hurricane exposure on the coast, and wildfire risk in the hill country west of Austin itself. Premiums are rising, the carriers are getting selective. Austin is not Detroit, it is not going to zero, but it does not have to go to zero, it just has to correct another 20 to 25% to wipe out a decade of equity for everyone who bought between 2020 and 2022. That correction is the most likely outcome on the table right now, and the people pretending otherwise are usually the ones still trying to sell you a house there. Number 1. Miami, Florida. Of course it is Miami, and before anyone tells me I am out to get the city, I want to be clear, I am not. Miami is one of the great American cities. The culture, the food, the international reach, all real. But the Miami housing market right now is the single most dangerous residential real estate situation in the United States. And I mean that in the same way mortgage-backed securities were the single most dangerous financial instrument in 2006. Not because the underlying asset was worthless, because the price assumed everything would go right forever, and everything is no longer going right. Miami is the intersection of every problem on this list. The insurance crisis is most acute here. Premiums for waterfront and even near water properties have crossed thresholds that fundamentally change the buyer pool. The condo reform legislation that followed the Surfside collapse has triggered a wave of structural reserve assessments on older buildings that are running into the tens of thousands of dollars per unit, in some cases hundreds of thousands. Those assessments are landing on owners who did not budget for them and cannot finance them. Miami also has the most exposed climate risk profile of any major American real estate market. Sea level rise is not a future problem in Miami Beach. It is a current operational issue. King tide flooding is happening in neighborhoods that were not flood zones a decade ago. The federal flood insurance program is being repriced under risk rating 2.0, and Miami homeowners are seeing their actuarially fair premium for the first time. The number is not friendly. The pre-construction condo market, which has been the speculative engine of Miami real estate for 15 years, is sitting on completions that are coming online into a buyer environment dramatically different from the one assumption that underwrote them. International buyers, particularly Latin American capital that historically supported the Miami luxury market, have slowed for reasons that are macro, geopolitical, and local all at once. Miami real estate is being held aloft by sellers who refuse to accept the new reality, by foreign cash buyers who are slowing, and by the assumption that this time, somehow, will be different. The math says it is not. The math says Miami is one storm season, one major condo building default, or one tightening of international capital flow away from a repricing event that becomes generational news. Miami is number 1 because it is the largest, most leveraged, and most exposed major American market on multiple dimensions simultaneously. Markets that face this many simultaneous pressures do not correct gracefully, they correct all at once. So what should you actually do if you own in one of these markets? I want to be honest. There is no clean, no downside strategy here. Anyone telling you they have one is selling you something or has not done the math all the way to the end. What I can tell you is what financially literate American homeowners with real equity in these markets are quietly doing right now. The first move is running the rent versus own calculation without ego. Americans have been culturally conditioned for generations to believe that renting is throwing money away and that owning is building wealth. That framing was true when prices were rising and rates were low. It is not automatically true in a declining market. If you can sell your Miami condo today for $600,000 and rent an equivalent unit for $3,500 a month, and that condo loses 25% of its value over the next 3 years, you have avoided a loss of $150,000 and paid $126,000 in rent. You are ahead by $24,000 and you took zero leverage risk to get there. That is before you account for property taxes, insurance, homeowners association dues, and maintenance. Run the actual numbers, not the emotional ones. The second move is understanding what a forced sale environment does to your timing. In a declining market, the sellers who act earliest take the smallest losses. The sellers who wait for the market to come back are waiting for a recovery that the math does not support on any timeline relevant to a human life. The people who sold their Phoenix homes in 2007 instead of waiting for 2008 took losses. They were also right. The third move is geographic, and it is the move nobody wants to hear at a dinner party. Capital that exits an overpriced market does not have to recycle into another overpriced market. There are American cities not on this list. Markets where the price-to-income ratio is still 3 or 4 to 1, where the local economy is genuinely diversified, where the insurance market is functional, where the climate risk profile is not actively repricing in real time. Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Buffalo, Kansas City. Boring cities. Boring cities are where boring outcomes happen, and boring is exactly what your housing equity is supposed to do for you. There are also asset classes outside residential real estate that do not require you to make a single leveraged 6-figure bet on the assumption that your specific zip code continues to attract exactly the right kind of demand indefinitely. I am not a financial advisor. Nothing here is financial advice. I am a person who reads too many CoreLogic and Black Knight reports on weekends, which is either a useful habit or a cry for help depending on the week. But the math is the math. Here is the question I want every American homeowner watching this to sit with tonight. If your home lost 50% of its value over the next 3 years, what would that do to the rest of your financial life? Not would it be bad. Of course it would be bad. I mean specifically, would you still be solvent? Would you still be able to service the debt? Would you still have options? Or would you be one of the people making decisions under duress in a forced sale environment with a mortgage balance that exceeds the property's market value? If the answer to that question is uncomfortable, the time to address it is before the correction, not during it. The people who looked at American housing in 2005 and said this cannot continue were called pessimists. They were also right. And being right early is only painful if you wait too long to act on it. The American housing market was built this cycle on cheap money, institutional capital, demographic tailwinds that turned out to be temporary, and a political environment that treated rising home prices as economic policy rather than a symptom of a system under strain. 3 of those 4 pillars have already shifted. The fourth, the political one, is starting to move. The window is not closed. Windows do not stay open indefinitely. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who owns property in one of these 9 cities. Not to scare them, but because they deserve to see the data before the decision gets made for them.